Welcome, retrogrades and parish orphans out there, to day 2 of Cath-Min-Gov-Week. Many people say today is the most exciting day of Cath-Min-Gov-Week because our guest, special guest of honor, Trent Horn, the only living Tridentine council father still, right? Council of Trent, is...
Boy, that's where'd you get that from?
Yeah, from Dave here. We're in Cath-Min-Gov-Week, day 2. Trent Horn, thanks for being with us, man.
Oh, it's good to be here, Tim. Thank you, Dave. Thank you guys for having me. I will say it was funny when I first launched the podcast, The Council of Trent, COUNSEL. It was funny. There were a few people online who said, I can't believe Trent Horn's doing this. He doesn't even know how to spell. And I said, well, like I misspelled council. And I said, why don't you read it again and have a pun in mind when you do so?
Why don't you understand that there are two words built into that? There's something called a homonym, and a homophone, I guess, is what it is. Not to be confused with a homophobe. And they call
I've been called that too, so that's fun.
Yeah. That's a badge of honor, but that's for a different show.
Sure.
Trent is as pretty much everyone here knows, the author of many books. Today, he features on Cath-Min-Gov-Week. Can you see this? Because of this great new book, Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? The answer is no, here's why. And, of course, he runs the Council of Trent podcast, Council of Trent podcast, and it's good stuff, and he works with the good people at Catholic Answers. Trent, man, so what a book. You're getting a taste of the blowback. Because now what I call free enterprise, I just go with free enterprise. Free enterprise is beset on both sides by the left Caths, and who really cares about them? Like Patrick Deneen says, they'll be liberals simpliciter in a half generation anyway. But especially now, the last 3-4 years, by the post-liberals, the Tradanistas, as John Zmirak calls them, the right-wing populists who have turned against free enterprise. It's a sour taste. It's a bitter taste. What do you say?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the Integralists Debate. If you remember that feud at National Review between David French and Sohrab Ahmari, the debate between how do we move forward as Christians? Do we work within liberalism where we have not just free enterprise, but democratic republic, we vote on things, we have the free marketplace of ideas to debate and discuss issues and defend the truth that way? Or what Ahmari was saying is, well, what about, integralism? We can't trust people to freely do the right thing, so we need everything to be planned. And so you have these individuals within the church, these particular kinds of traditionalists who invoke monarchism and distributism. And I think they have this feeling like, no, to restore Christendom, we have to centrally plan everything, centrally plan discourse, centrally plan the state, and centrally plan economies through government intervention. So ironically, while distributists in the past were, like Chesterton and Belloc, were very, very opposed to socialism. They fought hard, they debated against it. Nowadays, it seems that a lot of people who invoke distributism, they're very sympathetic towards socialism because it sounds very similar to the kinds of proposals they're offering, where they say, hey, we need to centrally plan to make a Catholic society, when that's just not the way it's really going to work moving forward in the modern world.
Well, that's a really good point, actually. And why don't we start there? Because I think that's a fundamental distinction that needs to be made within the kind of Christian socialism debate. There is some overlap between the kind of sharing that's set forth in Christianity versus the type of sharing at the point of a bayonet that's set forth in socialism.
Right.
But obviously, there's a distinction between the Christianity and socialism in that respect. Why is socialism unchristian when Christianity is, just to put it simply, one of the commandments of the gospel is that we share with, the poor among us?
Right. And I think the key difference here is that, and a lot of people, including those who are Catholic, and why I wrote the book specifically was not just a critique of socialism, which there are a lot of great books out there that critique socialism, Rand Paul, just released a book critiquing socialism, but specifically dealing with this idea that Catholics not only can be but should be socialists. I think one principle that they forget, and this is something that Augustine and Aquinas talk about, is that sometimes not every moral principle should be mandated by the state. And that if you did try to use the power of the state to mandate every moral principle, it would create greater evils than what you're trying to eradicate. So it's like we all agree that poverty is a natural evil. It is something that we ought to eliminate and alleviate. But I think for many people who are sympathetic to Catholic socialism, they think, well, we just need the state to coerce or impel this person who has a lot of wealth to give the wealth over to these people, instead of creating a system where the creation of wealth naturally and indirectly benefits other people, like a rising tide lifts all boats, so to speak. So I think that's the problem, is people don't see that we all agree there is a moral duty to help the poor, and that if you're a rich person who doesn't help the poor, you're going to go to hell. But it doesn't follow that it's a good idea to use the state to mandate that moral duty, because in doing so, you actually risk, and as we show in the book historically, you risk creating more poverty than that which you try to alleviate.
Yeah, really, you're really compelling in you showing that in the book. A couple of things. When you only deal with distributism per se in the appendix, and it's a great book. People really need to pick this book up, and I encourage them to. Just one thing, you weren't trying to critique the distributists. You were trying to go easy on them. You've caught some flack online because they really do favor the socialist side. A few things the book doesn't mention, but adds force to your a fortiori argument there. One, both Belloc and Chesterton were Fabian Society devotees. That's how they did debates there. Only Fabian Society members are allowed to do the debates. Right. Belloc said again and again and again. I was going to read a bunch of the quotes, but I thought, what the heck? It's so well evidenced in the philology, I don't even need to. That his critique of the socialists were that they weren't socialist enough. Both were strong enthusiasts of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Code, which destroyed contract. It said leave property intact, but destroy contract rights, so you can't even do what you want with your property. So he said again and again, the socialists, my problem with them is that they haven't meant what they said. That's a direct quote. And so as per Dave's question, there actually is the force of confiscation at law being advocated even by the first distributists. Chesterton's a little more muddy on the issue. He knew he had to be muddy, but Belloc comes to the point hard, and he actually puts his weight on it that forced sharing or redistribution is wicked. You're getting pushback from some of these people online, right?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that even when I put forward and critique socialism, but any kind of positive thing where I speak about capitalism or free enterprise just gets pounced upon, and I dealt with that actually a few weeks ago on Twitter when I was seeing people, they were saying like, oh, Jeff Bezos is going to be a trillionaire, which isn't true. He's not that right now, but they were talking about that, and they said that if trillionaires exist, that just proves we have to get rid of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And my thought, and in the book, we don't do a full-fledged defense of capitalism. It's not the point of the book. But we do refute the argument that you ought to be a socialist because capitalism is evil. And we refute that argument and show what the church actually teaches about it and the benefits that free enterprise has brought over the centuries by growing wealth and improving standards of living and things like that. So what I pointed out online is I said, well, and once again was the victim of a lot of drive-bys for this, is 100 years ago, we got the first billionaire and standards of living have really improved since then, with the growth of companies that have been able to create goods and services a lot cheaper for people to be able to access. Like, for example, back when Rockefeller became the first billionaire in the early part of the 20th century, 50% of a family's income was spent on food. It cost half of what you brought home just to feed your family. Nowadays, because food prices have decreased so much through mass production and through the growth of the food industry, we only have to spend about 14% of our income on food. And a lot of that is just on eating out. You could spend less if you only shopped at the grocery store. So it just boggles my mind that you had people, and once again, I don't want to get too far into free enterprise because I'm focusing on socialism, right. But just this idea, just this being repelled at a boogeyman understanding of free enterprise, which is just basically, look, what we talk about in the book for our listeners to make sure they get all this right. Capitalism versus socialism. Capitalism is just the view, I'll give you what you want if you give me what I want. I'll give you what you want so you can get what, it's a mutual and free trade. Give me what I want and I'll give you what you want. Is that Christian altruism? No, but it never intends to be. It's just a useful tool that benefits people. Socialism is the view, give the state what you have and the state will give you what it thinks you need. And when you compare those two systems, capitalism has brought the greatest increase in standards of living in human history than any other tool, whereas socialism reaps what Pope Leo XIII called a harvest of misery. And it's done so over and over again throughout history.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And as Sean Hannity has famously said over and over again, it's a good point also, no poor person has ever given me a job. It's the rich people that create jobs. It's those with wealth that's aggregated that are able to create jobs so that wealth can trickle down to those who need it most. So we shouldn't create this feeling of schadenfreude or of, I guess, envy of the rich. Honestly, we should appreciate those who have created wealth and who are creating jobs, because that's the best way, that's the best form of the best means to distributive justice, is for those to use their own talents, their own gifts to create jobs by using their free will, those gifts that God has given them. And then by doing so, they're creating wealth, and that wealth can be equitably distributed to those who kind of chase after it, and It's based on merit. There's input there, and the Catechism of the Catholic Church affirms that we do have a right to the fruits of our labor. So you're talking for a while, as you should, because many people really are consequence driven, but you're speaking about the practical consequences of the capitalist system, or I hate to use the word capitalist because it's a Marxist term, but the free enterprise system versus the wages of socialism and their effects. But even on principle, the Catholic Church affirms in the Catechism, it's paragraph 2429, that we have a right to the fruits of our labor. So 2429 says, everyone has the right of economic initiative. Everyone should make legitimate use of his talents to contribute to the abundance that will benefit all and to harvest the just fruits of his labor. He should seek to observe regulations issued by legitimate authority for the sake of the common good. But you're entitled to the fruits of your labor. And this works. So there's this underlying principle that, as a matter of justice, it would offend justice if you could create something and then it could just be ripped away from you. It could be purloined from you. But this also works to create good practical effects, because there's no incentive for anyone to create Microsoft if he knows that all of the fruits of his labor are going to be harvested by a government and distributed elsewhere. So not only does the free enterprise system respect lawful bounds, not only does it respect just the eternal moral law, but it also, in its practical effect, incentivizes people to create more wealth, and that wealth can be justly distributed by those who get jobs working for these companies.
Yeah, Trent, what I like about your definition, that's always my cross-check when someone's talking about the only two games in town. Forget free enterprise, forget socialism, just call them free economy and command economy. What I like about your earthy definition that's related to Dave, just your talking point, is you covered both my checkpoints, which are free economy is a non-intervention principle in both property and contract, and you check both boxes, right? Because that's the trade part, is contract. That's really what we mean by contract. I trade my labor for a wage. I trade my house to a lessee. Anything. You can go through a million examples. A lot of times the Catholics who are tending towards socialist, forget what you call them, who are tending towards socialist, they say, well, I'm not a socialist because I believe in mostly non-intervention in private property. But they don't check off the box for private contracts as well. They don't think, the distributists, for example, don't think that if you get 3 acres and a mule or whatever, you should even be allowed to freely alienate it, sell it, pass it through devise to your sons, right, or do whatever else with it.
Well, what's interesting, a minor point here before I get to the major point, both socialists and distributists do this sometimes. Well, distributists are really big on saying, look, we just want every person to have their own means of production so they're self-sufficient, which, as we say in the book, is not a bad thing. It's great if people can become self-sufficient. That's a good thing. It just shouldn't be mandated in a way where the government forces us all to start our own farms or something like that. So on the one hand, they'll say that, like, everybody should be self-sufficient. But I think, Tim, you can appreciate this as well. Then these same people will sometimes say to people like you or me who support our work through Patreon donations, you're just a bunch of worthless grifters who should get a real job. So it's like, wait. A real job would be me. I'm assuming real job in these contexts is working for an employer who has the means of production, and I get a wage from them. So, like, if I, like, through a crowdfunding or Patreon, or, you say you do Uber or Airbnb, that is the closest thing we have to what Belloc or Chesterton wanted, which is you own your own means of production, which is, if for now in the 21st century, it's not 3 acres and a cow, it's 3 computers and a modem, three microphones and a computer. But it's like, oh, you're just a grifter. I'm like, well, what do you want? What do you want?
2 turntables and a microphone, as Beck once said.
Yeah.
You guys all 3 computers? Because you're doing a lot better than I am.
Right. Well, 2 laptops and a desktop, actually. No, it's a great point. And my wife, Steph, Trent, just literally yesterday at lunch just made that point. And it's not some of the same people. It's like the exact same people that level that critique. Look, let's go back to the Amari thing. I have a couple more structured points.
Sure.
November 2019. Marco Rubio switched over his rhetoric to talking about common sense capitalism. Adrian Vermeule set the internet ablaze last month when he wrote an article on common sense constitutionalism. I responded to it. Common good capitalism, common good constitutionalism. The common good is the telos of the 4 Catholic social principles, right? Your book deals with it so well. So well. That's one of the highest compliments I can give, is that all of the Catholics that misunderstand the socialism question, the political economy question, they misunderstand the common good. Your book, even on the back, we're going to move into the pages in a second, but it says common sense about the common good. That's why I keep calling it common sense. Somehow this long discredited economic philosophy, socialism, is making a comeback not only on college campuses and political talk shows, but among sincere Catholics. I'd say as frequently there in Catholicism as on the university campus. Some think it could be the answer to greed and globalism. Some even argue it's the best way to obey Christ's command to help the poor. Let's give socialism a fresh chance, they say. A democratic socialism. This is so important. This time, friendly to religion in order to the common good, as the church says the economy could be. Can you say a word on what the real common good is? I'm guessing it's going to be contra Marco Rubio and Adrian Vermeule. Can the common good ever oppose itself to subsidiarity, Trent?
Well, no. Subsidiarity is an extremely important principle, one that Pope Pius XI said is something that is not just a practical principle, but he called it a principle of justice. He said it's something you can't set aside, which would be, for those who aren't familiar, the principle of subsidiarity says that higher organizations or authorities should sit back or subside to allow lower organizations, not like lower in being, but lower in regional or local authority, to address issues on their own. You only go higher up in the chain when you absolutely have to. So if you have a problem at your parish, you don't email the Pope, for example. You go up the rung, so to speak.
I do, but I'm
right.
different. Yeah.
Right. So when it comes to that, then the most basic rung, then when you the principle of subsidiarity would be the family. The idea that you would start with the family as the basic unit of society. And Leo XIII talks about this in Rerum Novarum, saying that there's no need to bring in the state to support the family, because it's not the state that makes the family, it's the family that makes the state. And so the state should promote, like when it comes to promoting the common good, an essential element of that is that the state exists so that we can freely exchange goods and services with one another. That if someone defrauds me, I have a court that I can go to. If someone's trying to rob me, I have police that I can call. So that if you're always worrying about, defending your property with a gun standing outside of your house, it gets really hard to grow your business when you have to do full-time security detail. So that's an element of the common good, that to facilitate these free interactions helps to promote everyone overall. Now, I can't speak to Marco Rubio and these others specifically because I haven't read their proposals in depth. But I will say I'm very suspicious about people who say, "Oh, well, I'm not a socialist. I just think that the government should order the economy towards the common good. You should be able to freely own property and sell it, but only to where it promotes the common good." But that's like saying, well, yeah, you should have free speech, but you're only allowed to write things that promote society. And if you say something that's detrimental to society and how I view it, then we're just going to have to censor that. So it's like, well, you said, just like that would be free speech in name only. This is free enterprise in name only when you're putting such severe constraints on it, so that what ends up happening is you're just trying to plan everything yourself. One point I also want to add, maybe we can get into here, is that I think a lot of people, and why we wrote this book, are buying into Catholic socialism because they have two mistaken ideas about socialism and wealth. One would be the idea that socialism is when government provides social safety nets. That's not socialism. I mean, you look at Singapore; it's like probably the freest economy on earth, and they have social service programs for the poor, for the indigent. That's not socialism. That's social welfare, and governments are free to do that with their tax revenue. Socialism is when society, the state, owns the means of production and is planning the economy and redistributes it. The other point I think people are missing in this is those who are Christian who support socialism are really operating with a first century view of wealth, which makes sense. They're reading the Bible and they're going off what the Bible says. Wealth in the time of Jesus, the reason that Jesus cursed the rich so much was because wealth was basically like a fixed pie. And so if you had a lot of wealth, the only way you could have that much wealth was because you stole it from other people, you exploited them, you enslaved them, you overtaxed them. It was very, very rare to become an ethical rich person in the time of Jesus. There was a Mediterranean proverb at that time that said every rich person is a thief or the son of a thief. And there's just this pie. And so if I have 3/4 of the pie, I'm taking from others. But now wealth is very different. Wealth is not just a fixed pie that exists and we're taking cuts out of. We can make more pies. We can make more wealth. So when people hear there's someone who has a lot of wealth, they think they're taking a lot of the pie when actually they're making more pies for people to be able to eat. And I apologize for making anybody hungry. But they misunderstand that. Yeah, and they want to apply one idea of how to alleviate poverty, which is, well, we ought to give money to the poor, which is almsgiving is a great thing. We ought to do that. But now that economies have changed in 2,000 years, we have many other ways to create wealth, and a fundamental way being providing stable industry for people to exchange their labor for decent wages, and then to save that and even grow their own industries and sometimes in the future.
Yeah, I think that has some import to these Catholic discussions over usury, too. There has been a fundamental shift in how money is made, and money has itself become kind of an economic boon or an economic tool. So definitely there's a commonality that runs through many Catholic debates, whether it's over usury or economic systems, about, I guess, just the nature of the economy during biblical times versus the nature of the modern economy. But you bring us to a good segue. And one thing that you'll hear apologists of this kind of Christian quasi-socialism or socialism or distributism, they'll often reference the goings-on of the early church and of the sharing of private property and the selling of private property among early Christians. Can you tell us why? Because you cover this in your book, and you say that although there was a practice of kind of property sharing in the early church, and there was this practice of selling what one has, selling one's private property, and then distributing it among the church. Why is that not a moral imperative? And why is that not a proof text for kind of this Christian socialism?
That this is the common one that always comes up. People say, well, Christians should be communists because the first Christians were communists. Well, they lived communally, but they didn't preach that the state ought to own private property and redistribute all wealth. In Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, we read about how the church grew after Pentecost. You know, Peter preached in Jerusalem, baptized 3,000 people that day, and a lot of people were there for religious observances, so they didn't go back to their home cities for this pilgrimage. They stayed to join the church. And now you have a huge problem. You got all these people who have essentially relocated to follow the church, to follow the true Messiah. And they need a place to live. They need to eat. And, you know, you can't just go and just get a job in the first century. It's a very difficult thing. So they practiced generous charity and shared what they had. Pope Benedict talks about this in Deus Caritas Est. He says, however, as the church grew, this radical form of material communion could not, in fact, be preserved, but its essential core remained. With the community of believers, there can never be room for a poverty that denies anyone what is needed for a dignified life. So as the church grew beyond just a small band of people in the first century who were kicked out of synagogues, who were persecuted by the Romans, they didn't maintain this strict communal lifestyle. Now, you're right, they did share property together, but that was something that was practical to help them to survive. It was not a moral imperative either now or then, actually, that people had to give up all of their property to the apostles like some kind of early communism. And the best example of that, for me, the best evidence for that is that the church never has and still does not mandate a tithe. Other Christian churches mandate tithing. The Catholic Church does not. And they didn't mandate tithes in the early church. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, when Paul is appealing to the Corinthians to make an offering for the church in Judea, he says, I'm not going to force you to do it because I don't have to. I'm not going to do that. He said, quote, each one must do as he has made up his mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So even there, Paul could have said, hey, all your property belongs to the church, hand it over. He didn't do that. So that's the point that I would bring when we come to the early Christian fellowship, that they practiced voluntary charity with one another, not anything like mandatory communism.
Can I just break in real fast? And
sure.
I'd like to add, I kind of piggyback on something that you said. You know, in St. Paul, in the scripture that you just referenced, yes, he's trying to retain intact this voluntary aspect of giving that really sanctifies the giver. And in the West, I mean, I say this a lot, and Tim, you and I have spoken about this. In the West, we're kind of starved for the poor in a lot of regards, you know, because the West is so opulent and so economically successful. Oftentimes it's like, man, I would like to help out people, and I'd like to give to people personally and see what I'm giving them actually be a help to them, and see it kind of make their day and be a delight to the recipient of whatever I give them, some authentically poor person. When St. Paul speaks of kind of retaining intact this voluntary component to giving, if you're a socialist, if you are saying that the government needs to step in and with guns drawn, take your money and forcibly redistribute it, it's robbing you of the chance to be charitable, isn't that? So that's a spiritual disservice. We talk about the common good a lot as if it only has this very earthly material component, but part of the common good is also spiritual common good. And when socialism is the economic system of a nation, you are robbing people of that voluntary aspect of giving. Many people just think, I've checked this box by paying my taxes, my inflated way too high taxes. I've done my charitable duty. I've fulfilled the gospel. And that's not the case. There's something sanctifying about giving, but in order for it to be sanctifying, the moral character of an act comes from its voluntary nature, right? And I just wanted to have you hit on that.
The confiscatory nature of the socialist state divests us Christians of the opportunity to freely give, because it's no longer a moral act if it's done at the point of a bayonet. To be fair, I would say, Trent, react to this. Free enterprise is so effective in generating wealth for everyone, and it just destroyed poverty in the world, that I guess it's, in a spiritual sense, it's divested us of the opportunity, at least in first world nations, Dave, this is where you began, of really giving to any needy poor that's not someone that's basically freely chosen through the use of drugs or some substance to be on the streets. We have to look to third world nations. They both divested us in opposite directions of an opportunity, have they not?
Yeah, well, first, to comment on that, we quote in the book what Leo talks about, how socialists want to create a kind of artificial equality among all people, whereas Leo says, no, actually the inequalities that exist among people are a good, because it creates a genuine human interdependence among each of us. So that inequality we have in wealth or fortune or talents, it creates the ability to practice charity towards one another. Saint Catherine Catherine of Siena put it this way: when she had a vision, she heard God tell her, "I could easily have created men possessed of all that they should need, both for body and soul. But I wish that one should have need of the other, and that they should be my ministers to administer the graces and the gifts that they have received from me. Whether man will or no, he cannot help making an act of love." So that to your point, yes, that this material inequality that exists provides an opportunity for spiritual gifts and fruits. Now, I will say there are cases of poverty in the United States that we ought to address. Sure. It is hard for me, like how I look at it. I feel compelled to give to the person who asks money for me in the street corner, because I feel like God has providentially brought this person into my life to help me. So there is a justification based on proximity. So I would agree with you that helping the poor in the United States would be more a justification of proximity than a justification of need. Because when it comes to justification of need, I choose to tithe and usually spend money on things like malaria nets in developing countries.
Right.
Like, people aren't dying of malaria here, but a $3 malaria net will save somebody's life in South America, Central America, or help someone be dewormed, or trichinosis in East Asia, which are things that we just don't deal with here. I mean, it's good that free enterprise has created a way so that I can get on my computer and I can donate either to these individuals, or I can use a microloan to a shepherd over in Kyrgyzstan or something like that, and then help this individual and not even charge interest to people who are the whole usury debate. Though I could use that to help other people.
Yeah, your book sets the I'm just counting the the 4 Catholic social doctrines. We're now checking the third, that your book really sets the record straight on common good right out of the gate. Subsidiarity pretty much thoroughgoingly throughout the whole thing. It really hits the nail on the head with the correct conception of subsidiarity. And what you just said is a beautiful expression of solidarity. The meaning of solidarity, perhaps the most misunderstood term by the Catholic socialists, whom your book really addresses squarely most of all. They're the addressee of the book. Solidarity is what Rocky described his relationship with Adrian, right? Filling gaps. There's a natural, we had on Jason Jones a couple times, and he's really, really good, Trent, on the issue of protecting the vulnerable, not just the poor, the economic poor. That's a Marxist idea. Everyone's vulnerable. They're vulnerable in different ways, though. We all have different lacunae, different gaps. And solidarity is created by the fact that maybe a rich old, money giver is like, hey, I want to find a great young conservative scholar. I'm going to give you some money. All you have to do is come by my mansion once a month and rap with me on the free market or something like that. He's vulnerable. Personally, the beneficiary of his help will be vulnerable, as most young people are, financially. your book does so much good in tying together the causational principles of the Catholic social teachings, the four of them, particularly the first three. Dignity is the fourth, and it's less on point. But envy. Let's talk about envy. This is Cath-Min-Gov-Week here on Rules for Retrogrades, and the socialists and the statists, who tend to be the same party,
right,
in different arenas, they play on envy, which is a sin in which the popes in these social encyclicals warn of again and again, warn against again and again with regard to the socialists. Let me read an Upton Sinclair quote. He says, "The American people will take socialism, but they won't take the label." Right, because socialism we now know is too predicated on envy. "Running on the socialist ticket, I got 60,000 votes, and running on the slogan to end poverty, I got 879,000 votes." It's funny to me that socialists writ large, they know they can't play on envy openly. These Catholic socialists you and I run into so often online, they more openly just say, "Look, I want your stuff." Why should just the fact that you earned it, is that the just principle for possessing it? What's with the envy?
Yeah, there's this idea, a cynicism that people don't really earn anything, that they're hucksters or they're tricksters, and there are people like that. But we've created a society where the ability to be able to earn income, to create wages. I mean, it was funny. I was on Twitter and I was just making this point about wealth, and I said that in the time of Jesus, like I said earlier in the show, you really only could become wealthy usually through exploitation. There were rare exceptions: Job, Abraham, Joseph of Arimathea. But many people at that time were rich through exploitation. But I said nowadays you can become wealthy through patience and compound interest. And then someone tweeted underneath, I didn't even bother to reply. They said, "Oh, look, at compound interest can barely get you anything." Well, yeah, that's if you just sit on money and you don't do anything with it. But if you save 5 to 10% of your income in a general, just map it to an index fund. Over the course of 30, 35 years, you'll be a millionaire. And it just requires patience, thrift, and now we have compound interest. So when you go back to Leo the 13th, he said that the goal of private property, which he said is an inviolable principle, and we talk about in the book how socialism is wrong, not just practically, but also principally based on what the church teaches. He talked about how the goal of helping people rise up out of poverty is to allow them the ability to own their own property, to be able to keep their wages, to spend thriftily, he said, and to save and grow wealth over time. And I mean, Pope Leo would be amazed the resources we have now for the thrift man to be able to grow wealth and resources over time. In Rerum Novarum 15, he says something interesting in your point of envy. He says that if you adopted socialism and just redistributed wealth and property based on what you thought people needed, he said, quote, "The door would be thrown open to envy, to mutual invective, and to discord. The sources of wealth themselves would run dry, for no one would have any interest in exerting his talents or his industry." And that's the problem of incentive that we also talk about in the book at length.
Yeah, and I just want to throw in on that, it's Catechism 2424, talking about socialism. A system that subordinates the basic rights of individuals and of groups to the collective organization of production is contrary to human dignity. So, you talk about, you're citing the popes, and it's Leo the 13th saying that private property is kind of this absolute right.
It's inviolable, because that's
Inviolable,
a strong
not absolute. Yeah.
Socialists will say private property is not absolute, and they're right. It's not absolute, because what they'll do is they'll take the universal destination of goods and twist the meaning of it. That yes, no one person owns the earth, but that doesn't mean that each of us can't lawfully own a part of it that we've got to earn.
Death would divest you. The earth belongs in usufruct to the living, as Jefferson says. And if it were absolute, then the state couldn't even impose a just fine on you. That's your economic property. But it's inviolable, which takes into consideration all these contingencies.
The universal destination of property, the Catechism calls it a primordial thing. So that transcends even the individual right to private property. But
Well, what I say in the book is that the Roman statesman Cicero makes a good analogy about the right to private property and how we could say the universal destination of goods and private property. It would be like saying, Cicero said, it's like how a theater in ancient Rome, a public theater, belonged to everyone in the city, but that didn't keep you from being able to own a seat in the theater. So it's like no one person owns the theater, everybody owns the theater, but you can own a particular seat and you could work to earn a seat with a better view, so to speak. And so that's the way we can see no one owns all of the earth's goods. It belongs to everyone. But just because the earth belongs to everyone, it doesn't mean property belongs to no one.
In chapter 1, you write, in John Steinbeck's 1939 novel, The Grapes of Wrath, banks are described as monsters that men make but can't control, and capitalists are depicted as heartless pursuers of profit. For example, I love this. In one scene, Steinbeck describes farmers dousing oranges in kerosene as starving people look on, because this was necessary to keep the price of oranges from getting too low. Full stop. Steinbeck doesn't tell his readers that it was the federal government that ordered the farmers to do this, which you saw all over the FDR admin. This is Wickard v. Filburn writ large. The federal government is the one, when it tries to get in that, get its claws in the command economy and work things around. You know, this is all, FDR was operating on the basis of Stalinism, as the Amity Schle's book, The Forgotten Man, makes really, really clear. It's the government that's stirring up that greed and the envy and almost always blaming the rich orchard owners or whatever as the bad guys when they're the
billionaires, Tim, the billionaires.
Exactly. They're the ones behind the curtain doing all this. The government. It's at the point of a bayonet. They're forcing envy from the poor to the rich when it's really them, isn't it? It's a great the way you make the point.
Oh, yeah. And what's interesting when you talk about where people are motivated by socialism, we do talk about how arts and literature motivate people. You have Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, for example, was written, it's, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's about the horrific conditions in Chicago meatpacking plants told from the point of view of a fictional Lithuanian immigrant. So he tried to promote this as a book to get socialism. Now, it got the FDA to pass laws about meatpacking plant safety and things like that. So it's interesting when people use this, you're right, to stoke envy and other things like that. But I think what's important to understand is that a lot of the situations where the rich seem to have an unfair advantage or where you have problems related to free enterprise, you're right, government is often at the point of it. So like we say in the book, for example, we applaud distributists who crusade against unjust monopolies, illicit business practices. But a lot of times, like the excesses of free enterprise, like monopolies that exploit people, business monopolies really can usually only be sustained through government intervention. When you have the free ability to set prices and to work with one another, monopolies get broken apart that way. An example might be when you go back to the quote-unquote robber barons, which was a term invented later in the 1930s to disparage the work of people like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt. Not like these people are saints, they're human beings, for crying out loud. But their histories were rewritten during the Great Depression. But you had people like Vanderbilt, who got rich with a steam ferry line. He got rich because the New York Hudson Ferry Companies were part of a monopoly established by the city government. And so they could charge really, really high fares. And so Vanderbilt started his own line with a business loan from like his mother. And he lowered the price, and he lowered the price so much he could actually do ferry trips for free and make a profit on food and beverages he sold on the boats, which no one had actually ever done before. So a lot of times it's this crony capitalism, or what I think it's Gene Epstein calls crapitalism, when government unfairly enters into the market and rigs it. That's where you get a lot of the problems.
Trent, let me pivot real fast to the problem of just wages, which I think, again, is a natural segue. A lot of people who advocate for a bigger government, especially a bigger federal government in the United States, one of the main things that they want is income equality. And one of the means, we talk about in Rules for Retrogrades, the book, that the left toils in incrementalism. They don't do things all at once. They kind of build and build and build slowly, piggybacking on prior victories.
Mm-hmm.
One of the means that they're using to get kind of just an across the boards equality in wages is an increased minimum wage, increased mandatory benefits for workers, paid time off for mothers in the workforce. All of these things that are basically top-down economic policies and regulation of excruciating minutia of business contracts. Now, the Catholic, we have Pope Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum advocating for some of these principles of paying a just wage also. So what's the difference between, Catholic just benefits for workers, just perquisites for workers, versus the statist version of just wages for workers?
Right, and I think that Pius XI actually talks about this in Quadragesimo Anno. So in there, he reflects about the 40 years that had passed from Rerum Novarum and the duties that employers have towards their employees. And first, what we would say is that a just wage is not just the money that the employer gives the employee, that the employer is obligated to give the employee dignified working conditions. So now some occupations are going to be more hazardous than others, but the employer should not treat the employee like he's just merely a cog in a machine. Leo says they ought not to misuse men as though they were things in the pursuit of gain or to value them solely for their physical powers. That is truly shameful and inhuman. And so then 40 years later, Pius XI says, look, we've come a long way actually since the time of Leo, that employers have undertaken, that laws have been passed that protect life, health, strength, family, homes, wages, labor hazards. He refers to how Leo says it's the great and principal duty to give everyone what is just. So then when it comes to the wage that we receive, and we talk about this in our chapter on just wages, the church's teaching understands that there is no fixed wage, that it's this dollar amount, because that would be simplistic, and that wouldn't even be true as prices inflate over time. Rather, the church talks about how there's really an upper and a lower bound when it comes to a just wage. So the lower bound would be a wage that is so low that it treats the person as if they're not really a human being that deserves money to compensate them at all. It doesn't reflect their human dignity. The upper bound that Pius talks about is that it can't be so high that it would be detrimental to the business, and the business couldn't even flourish or grow because the wage is simply too high. He also talks about the Marxist theory of value, which says that, look, the person who owns the business, the Marxist theory, the labor theory of value, which the church rejects, is the idea that the employer doesn't have a right to any of the income, that it should only be given to the employees, and merely owning capital doesn't justify your right to receive profit from a venture, even though you were the one who took on the entrepreneurial risk that the employee did not. That's something people forget, is that, look, people have this mistake, David. They think oh, the laborers are always in need. If I were just a capitalist, I would be fine. Well, no, if you have capital, you're going to run, unless you're fantastically wealthy. If you just own a small business, which we've seen with the lockdown, you're going to run out of capital if you don't have labor or consumers, and you're going to be destitute. They need one another. And the person who takes that risk, if you start a business and you go to work there and the business goes under and you're an employee, well, you can just quit and you're done and you go get another job. But if you're the owner, you got to file bankruptcy. You have a lot of irons in the fire. When you take on that much more risk, you are justly entitled to more of a return as a result. So we talk about a lot of that, but how that a just wage, it's more complex than just here's a dollar amount and there you go.
Can I push back a little bit on the floor that you set? I think I would say from my reading of many of these social encyclicals, isn't the floor that the church sets basically, especially for a family man, that he be able to provide for his whole family so that his wife doesn't have to go out and leave the home, Isn't it that the man should be able to provide for his entire family on the wage that he's given? Is that not the floor for the first and vital cell of society that I think spans several
That's
pontificates?
the goal. That's not.
Well, let's the Catechism in paragraph 2434 says, in determining fair pay, both the needs and the contributions of each person must be taken into account. Remuneration for work should guarantee man the opportunity to provide a dignified livelihood for himself and his family on the material, social, cultural, and spiritual level, taking into account the role and the productivity of each, the state of the business, and the common good. So in 2434, the Catechism, a lot is packed in there that, yes, society should exist so that you or I can go out and get a job and provide for ourselves and our families. But it doesn't follow from that just because society should make it possible for us to provide for our families, that every single occupation that exists ought to be capable of providing for any family through some kind of mandatory family wage. That would be an illicit inference from the fact that, yes, there ought to be a means so that we can get jobs and provide for ourselves. That should be the lower limit.
But not any job. You can't just get any job and provide for your family.
There is something that should be said for the fact that jobs should be understood, that there are certain jobs that are understood that these jobs are not intended to provide for families, such as part-time work that people take part in because they value the fact that they're working rather than being bored, for example. But I do agree there should be a plentiful amount of jobs for either a single person or a family to be able to provide for themselves from a single. I would absolutely love if every family could be provided for with a single income earner, and somebody could be at home with the kids. But just with the double income trap that we have nowadays, it's very difficult for that. So it's hard. Like, David, I totally agree with you that jobs should be capable of providing for families, including through single incomes. I just become skeptical when people take that truth about society at large and try to apply it to every single job, because I just don't see how it's feasible.
Well, it's utopian. It's exhortatory, right? It's an exhortation to say, man, wouldn't it be great if any job, even a typical sort of teen first job like bagging groceries, could be the kind of thing that were transformed into a wage for a family of 7 or 8. But
my first job, Tim, was, I mean, if you do that, I don't see how people enter the workforce. My very first job was at Harkins movie theaters. I was a ticket taker at the movie theaters. I made $5.75 an hour. But if at that time the minimum wage was like $15 an hour, I was an idiot, as most teenagers are wont to be. You know, why nobody would have given me a chance to break into the job market and acquire labor skills if you have to invest that much into it.
Sure, it's not supposed to be a uniform thing, and several popes have spoken about this. It is in Quadragesimo Anno, and it spans through Pope John Paul II, where it's not supposed to be this uniform application of a wage to every single person that comes into a company. So, for instance, a teenager who gets a part-time job at McDonald's should not thereby be getting the same wage as maybe a 45-year-old man who is trying to provide for his family at McDonald's. So there's a bit of a balancing, but employers are certainly, it's not just looking at the job that somebody is doing that gives them value, that gives their work value. That's a very inhuman system of calculating wages. Employers are actually supposed to be looking at the Sitz im Leben of these people, their situation in life and their needs. And before onboarding them as employees, they're supposed to be thinking, okay, what is a just way for this individual? That's my understanding of the church.
But the church doesn't. Let's go back to Rerum. I think it's the best one. Quadragesimo has the luxury of 40 years between Rerum and itself. But Rerum Novarum is excellent in terms of managing expectations. Right here on Cath-Min-Gov-Week, we're all about managing expectations. The church should address maladies, which is what Rerum Novarum does, not remedies. The church is not an economic organization. When it does, all the Austrian economists ended up being Catholic at the end of their lives. It's funny because they can work it out. The smart economists, the Austrian ones, who understand that there's only one political economy that squares with what the church is saying about the maladies, socialist utopian schemes that make everyone miserable, and with the human free condition, fundamental freedom, which is the human condition, theologically. But Rerum says, and this is what guys like you and me will run into all the time online as defenders of markets, Trent. Rerum will say, look, the man-to-man contract is important and should be honored, right? Meaning if an employee signs a contract for employment with an employer and he was kind of squeezed, if the employer is taking advantage, right, there is a dictate that's more ancient and imperious than that of contract, and it's justice. That what Leo's talking about is justice, and he can be punished for that. Which is why I like what you said about the rich man that does not give to the poor will go to hell.
Right.
That's really great. You said that. The employer that gouges his employees, particularly really faithful employees, will go to hell. Like, we can say that.
It cries out
just as a husband who doesn't who's a bad lord and householder to his kids and his wife, if he abuses them even just emotionally, he risks going to hell. But this is not a remedy that the church is getting behind. And these people all get, I'm thinking of a couple on Twitter, all get scared up and they're like, see, it's an older dictate, justice, than contract. It's more ancient, it's more imperious, whatever Leo the 13th says. But he's addressing the malady, not the remedy. It's right. Just as presumptive that Pope Leo the 13th is designating an afterworldly punishment that's due to these tyrannical employers as it is like an unlordly husband, right? It doesn't mean the law gets involved and starts telling people what's what in their own business. That doesn't work. Yeah. That's utopianism.
Well,
right?
3 points on that. First, when it comes to wages and providing wages, there's a difference between when these papal encyclicals talk about how a laborer needs to be able to provide for his family, for example, and then people infer from that we're only going to look at one aspect of the puzzle, which is the particular wage the person earns from working, instead of a more holistic approach, which would include things like opportunities for career advancement to get to higher wages, the ability to collectively bargain through a union for higher wages. In fact, when you look in the Nordic countries like Sweden, they don't have minimum wage laws. Most of their higher wages were secured through collective bargaining agreements. The ability to, as enterprise grows, that a lot of times when it comes to how do we help a man provide for his family, well, you can increase his purchasing power by increasing his wages or by decreasing the cost of the goods he has to procure for his family. That also helps provide for him by making goods and services a lot cheaper. The second point would be when you talk about the models, like the church, what do we have to present? In Centesimus Annus, Pope St. John Paul II said, quote, "The church has no models to present." When it comes to this, that are really the only models that are truly effective economically arise within a framework in different historical situations among the efforts of all those different people who can confront it socially, economically, and politically. He said, for this task, the church offers her social teaching as an indispensable and ideal orientation. That's Centesimus Annus 43. So the analogy I give in the book is to say, look, there's no such thing as Catholic economics, just like there's no such thing as Catholic medicine. Medicine should be informed by Catholic principles, like you shouldn't perform abortions, you shouldn't do assisted suicide, you need to get informed consent of the patient. But God didn't reveal to us how to cure people of disease. We have to figure that out through the science of medicine. Much the same way there's, and the distributists will absolutely blow their minds, blow their stacks at hearing this. There is no Catholic way that we were given to determine how to create wealth. That's a science of economics. Now, it's a science that should be informed by Catholic moral principles, and that's what we get here with the employers. But it's not like we were giving it to it writ large. So when it comes to the employers and the just wage situation, Tim and David, I think what's hard about that when you balance it is like, well, look, here's a dilemma. Let's say I'm an employer and I have a very small company. I could hire 2 people at $18 an hour, and pay them well. Or I could hire 3 people at 12, or let's say, 3 people at $12 an hour. So then it's like I have 2 people, I could give them a higher standard of living, but then what about that third person who remains unemployed and can't provide for anybody? So it's like then you have then the problem is now it's why the church doesn't have a specific teaching here. We're in this gradient trade-off. Like you don't want one person who makes $100 an hour, but you don't want 100 people who make $1 an hour. There's going to be a fine line where you divide the good of providing wages for people to support families and providing jobs for people to accomplish that goal.
Right, navigating scarcity and applying the church's principles are up to the individual, but they're going to be themselves guided by economists and sociologists who should ideally, and in a just world, be guided by the church's theology and philosophy. Right. But Trent, that's actually just another perfect segue. What can you tell us? What is moral capitalism? It's something you discuss in the book. And is it an oxymoron? And if not, how can it be achieved?
Well, we think about what capitalism is, and I like Tim's use of the term free enterprise, because capitalism was not something, it's not a term that Adam Smith came up with, for example. It was a term developed by Karl Marx to describe the system of free enterprise where you can freely exchange with one another, and people have freely exchanged for all of human history. What made capitalism different was that through the growth of trade, and investment, people were able to grow so much wealth, they could reinvest that wealth back into their own companies and grow them and create more wealth as a result, as through a kind of feedback loop. So we think of capitalism as just free enterprise, or just what I said before, give me what I want and I'll give you what you want. Then as we see, that's a morally neutral thing. That's just exchange between people, governed by property rights and contract rights. So the moral element, when you add in there, is that people, we wouldn't say, no, we don't worship capitalism like some sort of deity or something. No, it's a tool, just like a butcher's knife. You can cut steak or you can stab somebody in the back with it. You have to use it and apply it in a moral way, and you use these principles the church gives us. In Quadragesimo Anno, Pope Pius XI said, economics and moral science each employs its own principles in its own sphere. Right. So they overlap. There's an area where they overlap. There are strictly economic questions. There are strictly moral questions, and then there are questions where they overlap. So what we talk in the end of our book, and this is just a introduction to the topic because we were critiquing socialism, not defending capitalism. But we said, look, if we're moving forward on this, look at our different roles. And primarily the people reading this book are going to be consumers, not employers or producers. So what can we do to not fall into a culture of consumerism? What can we do to live thriftily and tithe and give what we have to be able to help those who are less fortunate? So how can we, worship the creator rather than the creature? And then if you're a producer and employer, what can you do to view your employee as a human partner in this and not merely as some kind of tool, or they're not the equivalent of a sack of coal or something like that in your machinations or something like that. So we put that all together and see that this is ultimately comes for that you have to have a strong spiritual foundation to be rooted in God, to be able to make good moral decisions, whether it's in economics or any other aspect of life. To finish that thought, it's like when you look at socialism, socialism is about centrally planning society to make everything better, or the economy. We look at what God did. God did not centrally plan the world by taking away our free will. He could have done that. Right. And he would have achieved many goods, but he would have lacked many goods as well. Like if God, this is the problem of evil with atheists. Like, why didn't God get rid of evil? Well, he could have gotten rid of evil, but you also would have lost goods like courage, charity, compassion. In a world without evil, you can't have courage and compassion, because courage only exists with danger. Compassion only exists alongside suffering. So the fact that it's not all centrally planned allows us to actualize those goods in the world. And the same is true in our economic life as well, to actualize goods related to charity, subsidiarity, and providing for one another.
Yeah, this is why I'm moving even out of calling free enterprise versus socialism. It's just a dichotomous free economies versus command economies. This sorts out all of the nonsense than the nonsensical arguments you get into with the variant strains of socialists like distributists who say, oh, I'm not a socialist because I like private property. No, unless you like private property and private contracts, you're on the side of command economy. So I encourage all the retrogrades out there to deal with this in terms of free economy, command economy. Here's the example I always give them. A little kid on a corner with a lemonade stand, right? They think this is a great deal. Usually when a little kid first goes to the street corner with their lemons and their water and their sugar, they got all the capital from their parents. They think, this is amazing. I'll set the prices at, $100 a glass. And of course, as Aristotle writes in Book 5, what happens when the price is too high? No cars will slow down. Then they're like, well, let's go to a nickel a glass, and cars are slowing down this much. The principle of scarcity is being equivocated here, right? And in a free economy, eventually, without laws that are onerous, that tell the little kids what price lemonade should be sold at, they will find that central principle where it's a high enough price to be profitable, but low enough so that cars actually stop. That's what I mean by a non-intervention principle. That's a free economy, is let the little kids figure out this principle of nature, where nature has selected a range of prices for a certain set of commodities. Lemonade's worth less than if they're selling shoes on a shoe stand. That's worth more. Whereas that's why I think so much confusion arises, Trent, is capitalism is a term like an ism, and Marx ascribes to it a kind of positive set of values. It has no positive set of values. Non-intervention principles are just, when they're rightly accorded, the way the church really does set aside room for a moral capitalism, as you call it, right, where if it's rightly done, and often it's not, it will just be a set of governing non-intervention principles that allow free moral agents to do economic intercourse with one another in a way where everyone benefits. Whereas all the command economy rejects the non-intervention principle, and it says we're going to intervene either on property or on contracts. That's, I think, what people should take away from your book. You're not some capitalist rah guy. It's an excellent book. Because it's what comes through loud and clear from the part I've read. I'm going to finish it this week on behalf of the Cath-Min-Gov-Week here, is non-intervention principle. Stand out of the way, government. And if you don't stand out of the way, you're one or another stripe of socialism, right?
Well, I mean, just to clarify the position I have, I'm not some kind of radical anarchist or something like that. There are times where government can intervene in sensible ways to promote the common good. Like when government says you have to have fire exits in your factory so women aren't throwing themselves down from triangle shirtwaist or something like that. Like, that makes sense. And the point I make in the book is that capitalism is something that can be abused, but it can also, or free enterprise can be practiced lawfully. Pope Pius XI said in QA that this system is not to be condemned in itself, which is never what they say about socialism. Pius XI said of communism, it's intrinsically evil, and no Christian could ever cooperate with it. So that's a point for people to take away from the book, is that we show socialism is condemned as an intrinsic evil people cannot participate in. Capitalism is something that can be abused. And also I would add that you can be a fierce critic of capitalism, free enterprise, and not have to be a socialist. You look at Adam Smith, for example, called the founding father of markets, or however you want to call him. He talked about the abuses within that system. He said, look, sometimes merchants will conspire together to artificially keep prices high and then actively use the force of government to keep competition from making them lower. And it's a prescient observation that he made, but that doesn't take away from his general thesis being correct about the goal of free enterprise. So what we talk about in the book is that socialism is not just immoral, but it's also just impossible, as Leo says, that when you try to act like human nature is perfectly altruistic, it just never ends up working. The example we use in the book are the Pilgrims in the New World, that they originally farmed everything communally and then distributed to everyone equal rations. And what happened was that, well, if I'll always get the same rations, I'm not going to try to work any harder. I'll just do the bare minimum.
The tragedy of the commons.
That's right.
The tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, but then food production ended up plummeting. It ended up plummeting as a result. And so then Governor Bradbury said, look, you each get your own plot of land. And they grew more food because that which you own, you take more care of. It's why, look, why is, I'm sure it's pretty true for everybody watching, it better be, your bathroom at home is probably going to be cleaner than the bathroom at the park. You know, when it belongs to everybody, nobody takes, and it's their own responsibility to actually have to care for it. When everybody uses it, but no one's charged with keeping it up, it falls apart. And also,
I
that
would say
yeah.
everyone's Led Zeppelin when it comes to their hotel room, right? They're misusing it. No one treats their bedroom at
Right.
home. You clean, you fold, you iron, you do whatever. Tragedy of the Commons. Everyone treats a hotel room horribly.
Dude, and my bathroom is certainly cleaner than the local public park bathroom because there's not like a bum that's high on drugs asleep on my floor right now.
Yeah, there is. Go check.
Oh, that's true.
Right. Yeah. So
his name is you.
Right. He's interviewing us now. We're all good. So, yeah. No. I mean, so that's what we talk about here is we try to get past the caricatures and show why. So, and I think a lot of the people who are advocating for socialism or principles that are de facto socialism, I do think that they have good intentions. They see poverty as an evil. They want to alleviate it. And so they have good intentions. The problem is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There are perverse, unintended consequences that can come from economic policies that are applied incorrectly. As we show in the book, it leads to food shortages. It leads to standards of living dropping, to starvation, to civil unrest. And we want to show, no, there are other better ways to be able to promote the common good by having, one, just, free interactions with people, and then two, to apply to that freedom supernatural principles of virtue and grace to be able to bless people even more through those free interactions.
Right. And socialism, as we were talking about earlier, socialism, when you have the government stepping in and forcing its hand, forcing charity, like there's no such thing as forced charity, by virtue of the government stepping in and creating wealth redistribution at the point of an economic bayonet, you are depriving people of this opportunity for virtue and grace. So it also, just to add, socialism is inherently disordered. It's intrinsically disordered. It's disordered per se. Capitalism, or free market, again, to get away from that Marxist term, that Marxist pejorative term, where Marx is trying to make a free market synonymous with having capital as the end in and of itself, this aggregation of wealth as an end in and of itself. That's not the Catholic understanding. That's not the Christian understanding of what a free market is to do. A free market is the best and most efficacious means of achieving distributive justice, of distributing goods according to one's merits. Because after all, the Bible does give us this verse, if a man does not work, let him not eat. And you quote this in your book, I believe, as you should. It's an important principle to keep in mind.
Well, St. Paul says that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That it's the scripture. But capitalism, or the free market, needs to be guided by, because becomes disordered or properly ordered based on the intention, partly of the theorist or the person who's proffering this system. So if you're talking about free market as a means to only the end of wealth aggregation, then it's a disordered thing, and it's inhuman. It's depersonalized, which is anti-Christian.
But it depends on the economic actors. It's not a system. It's just non-intervention principle. So it depends on the economic actors. If the people are good, they'll make it good. If the people are smutty, then porn shops will spring up and the employers will start gouging their employees. That's the whole point. It depends on the people. The fault lies not with our stars, but with ourselves. If in an economic...
and that's what Buckley said. He said, look, the problem with capitalism is capitalists. The problem with socialism is socialism.
Right. Amen.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say, like, it has to be imbued with the proper purpose, or else to have distributive justice as its lodestar is going to be the thing that makes capitalism or free market economy work properly according to the Christian model. When you have anything else as your lodestar, then it's going to run afoul and it's going to end up this disordered system that leads to perhaps great disparity of wealth and ultimately to perhaps greed and economic misery.
But it's free economy, so it really is. That's the difference between free economy and planned economies. To even talk about like there being a single lodestar of a non-intervention principle, it can be true where everyone kind of has the same goal in mind, where a bunch of Tim, Dave, and Trent are forming a new Catholic society, and we're just saying we're going to go with free enterprise, a non-planned economy. We can talk amongst ourselves and say, hey, let's try to get business owners that all agree with, distributive justice and are good Catholics. But since there's nothing centrally planned, if we founded a city, city-state, we couldn't really control it. It's up to the individual economic actors, and this is the genius.
Yeah, and that's the failure, and what we talk about in the book time and time again, why socialism fails, is that you can't really plan economies in this way. We talk about Hayek's problem of knowledge, that the other difference between free enterprise and socialism would be, how do you set prices? Now, in free enterprise, it's like it was your lemonade example, it's set by millions of individual interactions where people are flexible to set prices based on supply and demand. And that works because the knowledge of how much things are desired or how available there are is dispersed across these millions of actors. But if you try to get the state to set the price of something, or then to set how much it ought to be produced, then that is what in Soviet Union, Maoist China, Venezuela, every single time, you always lead to shortages because the state does not have that central kind of knowledge. It's kind of like, it's just hard, Tim, in these debates, you'll say, well, if we just made society this way, or we made it this way, it's like this debate about the lockdown with the economy. Society is not like a blob. It's not like a Play-Doh thing that you can just arrange into something. Society is just a shorthand term for millions of people who interact with one another. You can't this isn't The Sims, where you just plop them down and make them do certain things.
Right.
You can't make them do these things. Rather, you can set up a framework for them to ethically and morally interact with one another, and then within that, encourage them to their highest nobility and highest ideals. And so we should make something that respects their right to life, their right to private property, their right to raise and educate their family, to be secure in their freedoms, and then to encourage people to go beyond their mere rights to fulfilling principles of justice in society.
That's beautiful, man. Yeah, we're out of time, guys.
From the Catechism, guys. So it's that the church has likewise refused to accept in the practice of capitalism, individualism, and the absolute primacy of the law of the marketplace over human labor. Regulating the economy solely by centralized planning perverts the basis of social bonds. However, regulating it solely by the law of the marketplace fails social justice, for there are many human needs which cannot be satisfied by the market. So I'm talking about really the purpose behind the market at this meta policy level, more for policy makers as opposed to individual market participants. That's really what I was trying to channel, is that parsing soulless capitalism, this idea where you're just after money and you want to go swim in your pile of gold like Scrooge McDuck, from kind of an ensouled capitalism where it's ordered specifically towards the common good. We see it purposely trying to achieve what I keep saying, distributive justice.
And the other point to raise in these, because this always comes up, rinse and repeat, critique socialism, look how bad capitalism is. But I always hate when there's an argument or dispute about socialism, it's always the debate, here is my ideal version of socialism versus capitalism as how it is practiced, which is a totally unfair comparison. It should either be ideal socialism versus ideal free market, but we shouldn't even debate that because we live in the real world. So it should be real world socialism versus real world enterprise. And as we show in the book, when you compare East and West Germany, North and South Korea, Cuba and Florida, when you compare the examples, there's always a barrier that is created, and it's not to keep people from illegally entering the socialist state. It's to keep the citizens of the socialist state from illegally escaping, which tells you which system is more respective of the dignity of the human person.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm glad you got that point in, because it has to be real to real or ideal to ideal. Either way, free economies always win. My favorite sort of outro for this show is the second to last thing you said, Trent, because it fits so nicely on this Tuesday of Cath-Min-Gov-Week. One final stipulation in closing is I really am very, very close to you on this issue. I followed you for a long time. I said something a couple comments ago that sounded more like tomorrow's guest, Stephanie Slade, who's a little closer to anarcho-libertarian than you or I. So, and you kind of corrected me, and I'm with your correction. I'm not there at the anarcho-libertarian either. We have Stephanie Slade tomorrow, who you're saying you might want to bring on your show. We have Dr. Samuel Gregg we're talking to on Thursday, and then we're closing out Cath-Min-Gov-Week on Friday by talking to Robert R. Riley, who's been a long-time confidant when we were both writing our similar tone books. Also, little quick bonus guest on Saturday. I'm going to reveal later in the week here on Cath-Min-Gov-Week what it is. But Trent, you've been an excellent guest. I think this is sincerely, an excellent book that all Catholics need to read. As Obi-Wan tells Anakin at the end of episode 3, you've become a very real threat. The Catholic socialism thing it's become a very real threat, and lots of centrists in Catholicism are gravitating toward it. They need to read Trent Horn's book, Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? Dave, Trent, I'll give you the last word. Thanks again for appearing today.
No, I'll say thank you guys so much for having me. Appreciate what you're doing with the show. Keep fighting for truth. And I hope you can get the book on online bookstores. It's available on Audible. I actually read the book, so that was fun to do. And we're in the midst of planning. I think June 11th is the date. I'll finalize it here pretty soon. But I'm going to be doing a debate on whether a Catholic can be a socialist. So
with whom?
Sam Roca. He's a professor up in Washington. So it should be a hoot.
Send me links to that. I want to have your back. We're going to be cheerleading from the side there. That's we'll push that here on R4. Also, that's exciting. Everyone hit like and subscribe. I tend not to say that because I think it's annoying when other people do. But we looked at the analytics lately, and a lot of people that tune in regularly are not subscribed. So please hit like and subscribe, hit the bell and all that. And any final thoughts, Dave?
I think that encapsulates it. I think we've done a pretty good job here. And Trent, you're very erudite on the subject, so we appreciate your time. Thank you. I hope we can kind of cooperate in the future with our apostolates, because I think we have a ton of common ground. Obviously, you and Tim had the infamous feminism debate, but even moving beyond that, and once our feminism book hits, I maybe you could peruse it, and maybe we could discuss it on another episode of Rules for Retrogrades. Mm-hmm. But, I think we have a ton in common, and we can do a lot of good for the church by uniting our voices and speaking out against some of these banes. And we do need just more non-quack company men when it comes to Catholicism, who are going to be orthodox sons of the church, who are not tied down to any sensationalist or extreme ideologies. And I think we all three, cover that very well.
Well, what unite when it comes to principles of faith and morals? Look at our creed, look at what's in the Catechism. What unites us is more important and more fundamental than what divides us. We have differences, but everybody, I think it's important for us to see within the church, we are going to have theological and ideological differences, but we have to be able to help one another to combat foes that are promoting pernicious evils on a widespread scale, whether it's socialism, whether it's abortion, whether it's pornography, that are the evils that are just rampant. We are severely understaffed and undermanned to combat these kinds of evils. So while we have our differences, which is fine, people have their differences, I think it's good for us to be able to work together to combat the evils that are far more towering above us, and we need one another. And I'm grateful to have your guys' support and the support of other like-minded people who are watching this to be able to do that.
Amen. Yeah, Father Robert Sirico said it yesterday really well. He was just like, need to work together, man. Not any two human beings on planet Earth are going to agree about everything. So literally when I've had him on the show, people are like, well, look at this. Do you support this? I'm sure we'll get it in the comments, when we put this up later today.
When did that happen? Where like if you talk to someone, it's like, oh, you must agree with everything they think. Who started that?
Purity spiraling.
Talking
It's
to
the
Trent
worst.
Horn, so I like spotted shirts because you happen to be wearing a spotted shirt. I do.
I like
by the way,
spotted
Trent.
shirts.
I think you have a very handsome shirt. But
I checked with my wife before I came on. Like, does this look okay? She's like, I love it. I'm like, good. So.
Did you?
But yeah, but it doesn't mean I don't know where that.
Sweetheart.
Right. Hey, I don't know. I'm a man. I don't know what looks good. If I left the house, I would be color coded improperly. I need the help. So we all need help.
A man that leaves the house knowing precisely what looks good probably claps a little too hard at the Kumbaya masses and maybe doesn't watch enough football or something. But anyway, we're really out of time. Trent, we appreciate having you on, and keep up the good work, man. We'll talk to you soon.
I have a good one.
Good closing thoughts. Peace.